at that level. I don't think they should have sent a bill to this floor, even though they can correctly argue that if current sequester laws stay in effect, it will be reduced. They can continue to argue that, I recognize. But fundamentally...
The Senator has consumed 10 minutes.
I thank the Chair. Fundamentally, it's going to be harder for us to confront this problem as we go forward in the future, because we'll have more cuts over 10 months or 9 months than would otherwise have been the case if we don't make any of them in the first 2 months in this Congress. So I would say to our colleagues who are thinking about, well, we may need to waive the budget points of order, let's just go forward and somehow we'll work all this out in the future. We're going to be watching. I can't support it, but those who feel like they have to keep the ball moving, we need the House, when they send another bill back over here, it ought to be on the budget level, not above it. And I hope that they will do that. And that would relieve one more problem. But the big issue, truly the big issue, is how you understand the cost of this health care bill. My colleagues, using a score from the Congressional Budget Office, are going to contend that if you eliminate Obamacare, it will cost the Treasury money. That's what they're going to tell you. And that's what the score of CBO allows and states. But the CBO director told us it's double counting the money. You can't score this money twice, but according to the conventions of accounting, in the 10-year window over which this occurs, by reducing the cost of Medicare, that you can therefore spend more money on discretionary in the U.S. Treasury to fund a new program. You can do that and it will appear not to add to the debt. But the amount of money coming in is not, you can't count this money because it's Social Security money. It's simply borrowing that money from Social Security. It's going to add to the debt, and our own independent Government Accountability Office has said, according to the likely analysis of events over the next 75 years, as they do for Social Security and Medicare, this plan is going to be unsound by $6.3 trillion. In other words, what they're saying, you would have to deposit $6 trillion in an account today to have enough money to honor the commitments that are being made with the Affordable Care Act. So you'd have to do that much money in addition to the other revenues and taxes that are in the legislation and the payments that are made by Americans. It's not going to be enough, and you need that much more money. But we're committing to this benefit to American citizens. It becomes an entitlement. We're committing these benefits to them, and we don't have the money to honor the commitment. That cannot continue. We cannot, as a nation, continue. Wall Street and others tells us we've got to get our house in order. We cannot continue to add to our debt in this fashion. So I understand the difficulties members will be facing when they cast the vote as they come up here today. I'm not going to criticize any member on their vote, although I'm not going to vote to waive the budget. I think we ought to stay within our budget, and I think we cannot get by with this idea that the Affordable Care Act is actually going to improve the financial condition of America when it absolutely is not.
For a question?
I would be delighted.
Senator from Washington.
The Senator is such a fine leader of the Appropriations Committee and one of the most knowledgeable people here, a person I respect greatly.
And I feel the same way.
Senator
I understand that the senator from Alabama is the ranking member of the Budget Committee. Could the senator tell me why 6 senators have objected on your side of the aisle from having a conference on the budget. The Senate passed a budget bill 5 months ago, 5 months ago, and we could have been in a negotiation to resolve that. Could the senator tell me why those 6 senators object? Yeah. And therefore, because of that objection, we do not have a budget. Senator Murray passed the budget, working here in a marathon. You remember that?
Well, I certainly do, and I think I may have had a little role in the fact that a budget was passed, since I've been complaining. The Democratic majority went 4 years without passing a budget, several years without even bringing it to the floor. When the House was passing a budget every year, the Senate failed and refused a fundamental legal requirement to even produce one. But this year, our new chairman, Senator Murray, did bring a budget forward and did move it through the body. And there was a concern, I didn't raise it, but a number of colleagues on this side of the aisle said, well, we're glad to have the budget move forward, but we want you to commit not to raise the debt ceiling on a budget reconciliation, because you could raise the debt ceiling with 51 votes instead of 60 votes. Now, I know that senator may not like that, but that's exactly what was said. And Senator Durbin on this floor said he did not think that it could be done under the rules of the Senate, that we could raise the debt ceiling on the budget. But, well, then why wouldn't you agree to that? So the request from the people who objected to sending a budget forward to a conference was based solely, and they expressed it repeatedly, on the concern that budget reconciliation would be used to raise the debt and therefore not be subject to a 60-vote majority.
I thank the senator for his answer. I dispute the logic and the reasoning, but I thank the senator, and thank you for working with Senator Murray to move the budget. I will comment on that.
Mr. President, I would yield the floor, and if I've not used all my time, I would reserve the balance of the time.
Mr. President,
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I now yield 3 minutes of the proponent time to Senator Murray, the chairperson of the Budget Committee, who actually did pass a budget 5 months ago, but has been precluded because of sheer, rigid, ideological posturing for her to be able to go to a conference, sit in a room with Paul Ryan, and work out what the budget of the United States of America should be. This is why we have gone from the greatest deliberative body to the greatest delay body. So I yield 3 minutes, and any other time she would like to consume, to Senator Murray, who's done an outstanding job, and I wish people would follow her lead and let her go to the conference so we could have a budget.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I want to thank the senator from Maryland for her tremendous leadership, and she is absolutely correct. We are here in a manufactured crisis. This Senate and the House passed their budgets last spring. For 6 months, we've been trying to get those two budgets together to conference a deal to set our budget priorities for the next several years. We've been precluded from doing that by the same Republicans who now want to kill a continuing resolution that will just simply keep our government open for a few short weeks so we can do the work we should have been doing for the last 6 months. Mr. President, the answer to this is easy. Let's pass a clean resolution, keep the government open for a few short weeks, do the responsible thing, say to the nation and to the world we will pay our bills and raise the debt ceiling, and then do what we need to do, every one of us knows we need to do, is work out the differences between the House and Senate budget. But we are here today in a manufactured crisis because the same Republicans who are now leading us to a shutdown are saying that they don't want us to talk. Mr. President, I agree with the senator from Maryland. Let's keep the clean resolution, send it to the House, keep government open, and do the responsible thing that we should do as leaders and adults and come to a budget agreement. But, Mr. President, I also want to speak today and urge my colleagues to support the Majority Leader's motion that he will bring to us to waive the budget point of order against the continuing resolution that we will vote on here in a few hours. Now, my Republican colleagues who announced their intent to raise this point of order are concerned that the funding levels in both the House and Senate continuing resolutions violate the Budget Control Act. But, as we all remember, Mr. President, sequestration was never supposed to be implemented. It was supposed to be so unthinkable that it would force a compromise, which is what we are going to have to do here anyway. But since those automatic cuts took effect, we have now heard from families and communities across the country sequestration is costing us jobs. It is slowing our growth. It is harming our national security. That is exactly why the Senate and House budgets both require changes to the Budget Control Act. Now, it's true we took very different approaches to altering the automatic cuts. The Senate budget, our side, fully replaced the sequestration. We did it with an equal mix of spending cuts and new revenue that we raised by closing loopholes that were skewed towards the wealthiest Americans and biggest corporations. The House budget, on the other side, replaced sequestration fully also, but they did it by fully funding defense programs, paying for that with very deep cuts to investments in families and jobs, all the while protecting the wealthiest Americans from participating in this at all and helping to pay for it. So we do have a lot of work to bridge that divide. There's no doubt about it. But that alone shows how important it is that we pass a clean, temporary, continuing resolution to keep the government operating while we have that space to negotiate a longer-term budget agreement that works for our families and economies. Mr. President, I ask for one additional minute.
Without objection.
To do that, we've got to be able to finish this bill, send it back to the House, and get our country on the right course again. So, Mr. President, voting to sustain this point of order isn't voting against a funding level or a policy you oppose. Voting to sustain this point of order is voting for a government shutdown. Because, Mr. President, if this bill dies that's in front of us today, it's very likely the government will not be open for business on Tuesday. And then our American families are going to have to deal with disruption and all the uncertainty that will cause. So, Mr. President, there's no reason to let the gridlock and dysfunction in Washington, D.C. cause more harm to our families and businesses. A vote for this point of order is a vote to kill this bill and shut down the government. And we do not want that to happen. So I oppose it. I urge my colleagues to join me in waiving the point of order when we have that vote later today. Let's pass a clean continuing resolution, have the House pass a clean continuing resolution, and then do the job we were sent to do. Every one of us knows it needs to be done, which is to bridge the divide between the House and Senate budgets and get our country back on track again. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank the gentle lady from Washington State for her comments because, as usual, they were clear, cogent, and compelling. We need to get a job done today. Our job today, am I correct, is that we pass a continuing resolution, which means we keep the funding at fiscal 2013 in place till we resolve other budgetary issues with the House. Is that correct?
I would say to the Chairwoman of the Appropriations Committee that is absolutely correct.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, shortly we will be voting at 12:30 on 4 votes. Those 4 votes are 1, cloture on the continuing resolution, waiver of a budget act on the point of order, the amendment that I offered on the continuing resolution, and final passage. But essentially, it's all pretty much the same thing. It's 4 separate votes that get there. Our goal today is to send to the House of Representatives a continuing resolution stripped of ideological riders that keeps the government funding until November 15th while we work out other budgetary issues. The continuing resolution historically has always meant to be short-term, to get us over problems, to keep the government functioning while we solve problems that we have been working on. And it has always been, historically, not to have ideological riders attached to them. So what we want to send to the House of we the Democrats, and hopefully with others who will join with us to find the sensible center. The sensible center. America always governs best when it finds the center, a sensible center, that we want to find that and send it to the House, where, number one, our continuing resolution would be until November 15th. This gives us a couple of weeks to work these issues out. Number two, to take out the ideological riders. The first rider is to defund President Obama's Affordable Care Act. We want to strip that out because it is now the law of the land. There is no need to keep fighting the same battle. Number two, there's an ideological rider on how we structure paying our debt. That rider is a rigged game that we pay China first before we pay other obligations to people here and debtors in our own country. We want to strip that out and then send the continuing resolution, which is not new money, Mr. President. It keeps the government operating until November 15th at fiscal 13 levels. That's where we are. So I want to explain that if we don't do this, we could head to a government shutdown. And it is harmful to our country, it is harmful to our economy, and it is harmful to our standing in the world. In plain English, after debating the continuing resolution last Thursday, we now have these four votes. A vote to waive a point of order, one of which is a vote to waive a point of order against the continuing resolution. They're essentially we could end up with more sand in the gears. Where we are now is that the vote on the Senate amendment to the House CR, as I said, means stripping out partisan ideology, shortening the date, and moving on so that the House can look at it. A government shutdown is a serious matter. If we don't come together across the aisle and across the dome and across town, we will be facing a damaging government shutdown. Here are a few things that will happen. If we cannot enact a clean continuing resolution by October 1st, our troops, including troops deployed overseas, will not be paid on time. 800,000 civil servants who serve the American people will be sent home and told they're non-essential. Shutting down the government will have an immediate and harmful effect on our economy. Small Business Administration approval of loans will be put on hold. Important rural development housing and farm loan grants will stop. Our economy is struggling to pick up steam. The uncertainty that we will create in the marketplace and in our own country and in the world will put on the brakes of our economy. It is irresponsible and unacceptable for this to happen. Every day, thousands of federal workers keep Americans safe. We don't hear about them every day, but they do make a difference. Every time a defective product is removed from the market, every time an inspector recommends a change to keep people safe in terms of approving the safety of our food supply or our drug supply, every time a schemer or scammer is arrested for fraud, the federal government and the people who work for that have played an important role. In my own state, I represent the National Institutes of Health. Last spring, Director Dr. Francis Collins announced that we had reduced cancer rates in this country by 15%. Instead of pinning a medal on the men and women who did the basic research that could then lead to the private sector inventing new pharmaceuticals and biological products that would put that into clinical practice, instead of that, they had to announce a furlough. How would you like to be working at NIH right this minute and told you're non-essential? You're working on a cure for cancer. You're trying to find out the causes of autism. You're trying to come up with at least a cure or cognitive stretch out for Alzheimer's. Just talking about the A words are amazing. And then we're told, you're non-essential. Oh, they didn't know that. And you know what? The American people don't believe it. We have to avoid a government shutdown and a government showdown. What we need to be able to do today is to be sure that we work on our amendments and make sure that we have cloture on the continuing resolution. We've had substantial debate. It's now time to bring that together. Waive the Budget Act on a point of order. Pass my amendment to change the time to November 15th, and then have final passage. Mr. President, the time is to act now. You hear in my voice great frustration. I'm frustrated because, not because of solutions that I don't like. That's give and take in a legislative process. What I'm frustrated about is the continual process of delay, where we not only throw sand in the gears of our ability to function, we're now throwing cement into those gears. Mr. President, I hope we can move. There's cool heads on both sides of the aisle. There are people on both sides of the aisle that have worked together and can come together. Let's pass this continuing resolution, have the House act so that we can avoid a shutdown, so that our focus is on solving the important issues facing our country. Yes, there are those who call for reducing the public debt, and I support that. And we can do that through a balanced approach, additional strategic cuts, a review of mandatory spending, and a look at closing tax loopholes. But there are other debts that we have. We have the issue of chronic unemployment, of growing education unattainment, where our standing in the world is slipping. I can worry about the fact that we won't fund the research and development necessary, working with the private sector to come up with those new ideas that lead to new products, that lead to new jobs. DARPA, a government agency, helped create the Internet. Then the genius of our private sector unleashed the power that the world has never seen. This is what America is known for: discovery, entrepreneurship, moving our own country ahead. And this is what I would hope we would get back to. Let's get through this process. Let's get through this quagmire, and let's keep America being what America can be. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I do have time right now that is scheduled. However, my very good friend from Alabama had one other mention to make, and I'd like to yield maybe, let's say, 2 minutes of my time to the senator from Alabama.
Thank you. Mr.
Senator
President,
from Alabama.
as I explained the unfunded liabilities of the Affordable Care Act, I want to make something really clear. It's a lot more than that. We are assuming, unlike Social Security and Medicare, there's a dedicated tax that supports those programs that are on our payroll, the withholding every week, the FICA withholding. That is dedicated to Social Security and Medicare. There's no dedicated tax support for Obamacare. So if you assume all the new taxes that they raise are actually used to fund Obamacare, then there would be a $6.3 trillion shortfall liability. But if you do it like it really should be accounted and assume that there's none of this money that's being raised in taxes is actually dedicated to the Affordable Care Act, then it runs about $17 trillion. And Congress is well known, unless your tax money is absolutely legally dedicated to something, it gets spent on other things. So we have no confidence we'll come in just a $6.3 trillion And it's likely to be far higher than that, the way we know this body operates. I thank the chair and would yield the floor.
Senator from Oklahoma.
I think and certainly do agree with my good friend from Alabama. He's done a great job on this subject. I would like to say that one of the things I enjoyed about the presentation that was made by my good friend from Texas, Senator Cruz, was that we were in a position that's very rare in this body where we could talk as long as we wanted to. In fact, we actually tried to talk longer, and we're looking for different things to fill in we may have forgotten. Now, that's not where we are today, and so we are confined. But I have to share with my good friend in the chair that something I'm going to say now is going to be very offensive to a lot of people, but I really don't care. Because at my age and being here, I think I know what this country is all about, and I think I know that we have the obligation to express our true feelings. I have written a speech and have put it off, and I'm not going to give it today, but I was rereading it this morning. I had no intention of coming down and talking because I talked long enough during the course of the cruise talk. But I went back and reread the speech that I was going to give, and what it is to answer the question. It really, one of my sons said to me, and everyone has been saying this over a period of time in Oklahoma, I don't think Oklahoma is that different from other states. But they ask me over and over and over again, they say, what happened? Why is it that we have an administration and people in government, not just the Obama administration, but others, who are praising Islam and trashing Christianity or trashing the Judeo-Christian values and the other things that are happening today? And we all know it's true. You know, how do you answer that? It's a tough answer. So I was going to make, I'm preparing, and I'm going to, later on, I'll give you a little warning, I'll be making a talk. I've done a lot of research on this. There's a guy named Paul Johnson who wrote The History of the American People. In that he talks about how we got where we are today. Now, this is going to tie into Obamacare. But and he says that the Puritans were devoted to and single-minded to their ambition of creating a colony that was built upon the foundation and teachings of Jesus Christ. The Mayflower Compact is evidence of this, and Paul Johnson, the guy who wrote that the book I told you about, is right to observe that the document was not just a contract between a servant and a master, or a people and a king, but between a group of like-minded individuals with God as a witness and symbolic co-signatory. And why is this important? It's important because William Bradford and the other Puritans understood that while forming a civil government was fully within their right, there were limitations to what they could and could not do. They're talking about government here. And those limitations were established by God and enumerated in the Bible. I go on when I make my talk on this, I quote the Apostle Paul in Romans, but there's not time for that. I'm going to go on to say it is within the foundation of the biblical authority that the Puritans crafted the Mayflower Compact and their system of government at Plymouth Colony. Paul Johnson rightly observes that this line and model of thinking was critical to laying the foundation for a successful United States of America. And ultimately, it is a morality derived from God that had its strongest enduring influence over the nation. And this is what has crafted our history as a strong nation. I say all of this as a predicate to the answer that people ask me, you know, why is it that we're trashing our Judeo-Christian values in favor of something that was not American to start with? And sadly, our nation does not have the same belief today that we had back during during that time in our history. We've become arrogant, inward-focused individuals. Rather than submit to God's authority and definitions of truth, justice, and goodness as we conduct our government's business, we have replaced them with our own ideals, defined by what feels right at the time. As Americans, we now look inward to ourselves to define with fluidity and foundation of truth. We have allowed ourselves to become ultimate arbiters of what is right and wrong instead of the higher morality of God. And lastly, was going to be in this talk, and this time getting back to the subject at hand. Today, instead of having leaders who are protecting the church from government, we have leaders who believe it's government's job to impose on churches what should be universally upheld as truth, instead of leaders who are protecting an American's freedom to practice his or her religion on their choice. Now, here I'm not talking about the choice you may be thinking about. They are instead using government institutions and law to force them to do or buy things that are in very violation to their religious and conscious beliefs. Now, that's the issue we're talking about now. Government has become so strong and influential in our lives that we are losing our powers, and these are our ordained powers that we know we're part of this country. We know all about it. There's not a person in here who didn't study the Pilgrims coming over on the Mayflower and having that meeting in the captain's chamber and making these decisions, and now where we are today. And I'm going to give you an example, because I have a friend in Oklahoma whose name is David Green. David Green started a company called Hobby Lobby. Now, David Green and his wife started this company by making picture frames in their garage, and then they had the first store was 300 square feet, and it was opened with the profits that they made in their little garage operation making picture frames. Over the years, their business has grown to 550 stores. It has annual revenues of $2.5 billion. And David Green has had success despite running his business in a very counter-cultural way. For instance, all of the retail stores close at 8 p.m. each night and all day on Sundays so employees can spend time with their families. This is appreciated by the company's 16,000 employees, that all started in the garage, who are paid at a minimum of $12 an hour, despite what they could be paying a much lower rate, legal rate. At one point, the company was challenged by a competitor who said they would bury Hobby Lobby with their money, so the firm opened its stores on Sundays, ultimately earning the company an additional $100 million in revenue each week. But eventually, David Green was challenged. He said he was challenged by God to trust in him with his business, to go back to his policy of closing on Sundays, and he did, and his business has prospered. One of the largest businesses in America today. David's Christian faith runs deeper than his desire to have a profitable, successful company. And when he faces a decision of whether to make more money or to obey God, he chooses to obey God, whatever the consequences. Now, keep all that in mind and listen to this. This is where we're getting around to this subject. Recently, he was faced with a new test. It didn't come from a competitor. It came from the United States government. Part of the Obamacare law requires employers not only to provide health care insurance to their employees, but also to provide free access to the pills that terminate pregnancies. And David, as I do and many others believe, and some don't believe, but we believe that life begins at conception, and offering an option to end that life would be in violation, in his case, of his moral compass as defined by his faith in Jesus Christ. Now, as a result, he said he would rather pay the $1.3 million a day in daily fines from the Obama administration than comply with the law. Here's a guy who feels so strongly in his beliefs that I think are consistent with the beliefs that made this country great, but that's just my belief, that he would pay $1.3 million a day in fines from the Obama administration rather than comply with this law. Today, the Obama administration is vigorously opposing Hobby Lobby's legal challenge to the mandate, claiming that this privately owned business is waging a war on women for not agreeing to provide these treatments for its employees free of charge. You know, that's just one example of what's happening. And by the way, in my state of Oklahoma, and I don't think we're that different from most other states, last week, 4 universities in my great state of Oklahoma have filed a lawsuit against the federal government over the Obamacare mandate to provide certain types of contraception to their employees. These are 4 universities. joining with this one great American named David Green. And so we have now that the faith of an individual and the feeling that he has in what he's willing to do. And he is willing to stand up to this abusive government that we have today and to this law, this Obamacare law, and is willing to pay $1.3 billion a day. Now, you know, I look at this and I have strong feelings, just as strong as he has on this subject, but this is a subject for another day. You know, I always remember, I've got, my wife and I have 20 kids and grandkids. And back in the old days when we were having our kids, there was kind of a rule. You couldn't go in the hospital. I say my good friend who's occupying the chair. And so you couldn't see this. You had to kind of wait outside, and you didn't have all this notice of what the baby's going to be and all that. But in this case, my first grandchild, I found out that my daughter called me up and said, all right, Daddy, come on over, it's time. And I went over into the hospital, and it was actually in the delivery room. What a great experience was that. My gosh, I never dreamed that ever happened. Now, we're talking about a number of years ago, 16 years ago, 17 years ago. And so I watched this take place, and I honestly, a tear did come out to my eye. At that time, we were talking about partial birth abortions, and the fact that they could have taken little baby Jace and jammed scissors into his skull and sucked his brains out. And that could have happened, but it didn't happen. So I feel just as strongly as he does. And the point I'm making here is, you know, you can make all the arguments about this, and I've made arguments on the floor during the Cruz debate. That I remember 19 years ago, Hillary health care, the same thing. It was government taking over the health care system. And I have my friends in Parliament in Great Britain who call up and say, you know, what's wrong with you guys over there? Don't you realize that, you know, we are just getting away from this thing that hasn't worked? Socialized medicine. Now, don't kid yourself and think this isn't a road to socialized medicine if we end up not being able to do something about Obamacare. It is. In fact, the leader, I have a great respect for the leader of the Senate, Reid. Senator Reid himself said, yes, I believe this is leading to, and I endorse, leading to the single-payer system. So we are talking about socialized medicine. They call up and say, hey, what's wrong with you guys? It hasn't worked here in Great Britain. It hasn't worked in Denmark. It hasn't worked in Canada. And yet you're somehow thinking it's going to work there. So that's kind of the big issue. We have an abusive government, and this is just probably the greatest single step that we've witnessed in the last 4.5 years as to the abuse that's taking place. And so I really believe that we need to look at the big picture, do something about this. And you say it can't be done now, it's too late. You're probably right now. But they said the same thing about Hillary health care 19 years ago, and I'll never forget it. Because here I was on the plane going back to my state of Oklahoma with a stop in Chicago, and I thought we finally today drove the final nail in the coffin and killed Hillary health care, and yet I picked up the Wall Street Journal, and there's a full-page ad by the AMA endorsing Hillary health care because they had given up, and that was the day before they gave them that story. So anyway, it's never too late. This is something that needs to be stopped, and I have faith in the American people that somehow we're going to win this thing. I thank the chair. I know my time has expired.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I would yield 8 minutes to the senator from New Hampshire, Senator Shaheen.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I'm pleased to join my colleagues on the floor today, the members of the Appropriations Committee, and others who have been down to speak in support of passing this continuing resolution. I'm a new member of the Appropriations Committee, and I've been very impressed with the work that our chair, Senator Mikulski, and Ranking Member Shelby have done. They have crafted the appropriations bills that would really address the budget for the coming year. Those appropriations bills would replace the harmful cuts from sequestration. Those are cuts that people on both sides of the aisle have said they opposed. But unfortunately, because of the obstructionism we've seen so clearly this week, those bills haven't yet come to the floor. And so we need a short-term CR to keep the government open. Now, we all know that the continuing resolution that's before us today is not ideal. It's short-term, and it doesn't replace sequestration. so it doesn't either deal with the cuts or give businesses and our economy the certainty that they need. But this suggestion that we should refuse to keep the government open is just irresponsible. There is just too much at stake for our economy, for our small business, for our families across this country. And unfortunately, what we've seen this week is that there are some who are pushing this country to the brink of another manufactured crisis as a tactic to prevent health care reform from going into effect. Now, I'm not going to review what Senator McCain said, I think, so well about how the democratic process works in this country, about the fact that once a law goes into effect, that it's important to implement it. And, you know, I think democracy works, but it doesn't always work the way I want it to either. But when a law is passed, we have a responsibility to go ahead and make it work. And we've seen a small minority of this body and of the House who are willing to shut down government to defund the new health care law. Now, the people I talk to in New Hampshire don't think that shutting down government is a good approach because they understand the serious consequences it would have for them, for their businesses, and for the country. It would especially hurt small businesses, which are the foundation of the economy in New Hampshire and the presiding officer's home state of Maine and Rhode Island, Senator Reid's home state. Those small businesses create 2 out of every 3 new jobs. And many of those small businesses in New Hampshire and across the country rely on federal contracts as they figure out how they're going to grow and create new jobs. We talked to one CEO of an innovative small company in New Hampshire who told me if its contracts were shut down, and I quote, he said, "Our income would drop to essentially zero. We would burn our very thin cash reserves, and when that money is burned, it is not able to be replaced. So our basic financial viability can be irrevocably damaged even after the crisis passes. There will be no way to recover those dollars." Now, we had a chance to hear from former Secretary of the Treasury Bob Rubin this week, who said that unlike 1995, when there was a short-term consequence to shutting down the government, that if we do that this time, it will be felt not just for years, but for decades to come. A shutdown would close the Small Business Administration's lending programs, and those SBA lending programs are critical to small business in New Hampshire and across this country. On average, SBA supports loans to over 1,000 small businesses per week. And then there's the housing market. In New Hampshire and across this country, the housing market has been one of the slowest sectors to recover. But in the last year, we've begun to see some signs of improvement. The Federal Housing Administration has been a big part of that recovery because they've helped families afford homes and kept our housing economy afloat. Under the shutdown, it's estimated that assistance to 34,000 homeowners would be delayed. And with all of the problems that have been caused by the housing crisis, we should not be stalling one of the most effective programs we have for assisting homeowners. And that's what we would do with a government shutdown. And then, of course, this would be terrible timing for the tourism industry in New Hampshire and across New England, because fall foliage is one of our biggest seasons, and tourists come from all over the world. They spend money in our local restaurants and hotels. Many small businesses rely on this time of year to increase their revenues. But if the government shuts down, we'll be turning away those customers. Applications for visas will come to a halt. And according to the Congressional Research Service, during the 1995-96 shutdowns, approximately 20,000 to 30,000 applications by foreigners for visas to come and visit in America went unprocessed. That's going to affect not just the tourism industries in New Hampshire, it's going to affect airlines, it's going to affect people across the country. And then, of course, there are our federal workers. In New Hampshire, there are 7,400 of them. It's one of the state's largest employers, the federal government, and their salaries aren't just important to them and their families, but to the grocery stores and the gas stations and all of the other businesses they support. And the presiding officer certainly knows with me about the impact on the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard of a potential government shutdown. So these are just some of the effects on the economy. And considering the many industries that would be affected, it's no surprise that economists have forecast that failure to pass a continuing resolution, as Bob Rubin said, would do significant damage to our economy. Even a 3- or 4-day shutdown could slow growth by 0.2%, according to economist Mark Zandi. And you know, it doesn't have to be this way. I was a governor for 3 terms. The presiding officer was a governor for 2 terms. We understood what it was like to work across the aisle, and we always passed a budget because we had to put in place a budget.
Remaining.
Thank you. There are a lot of differences on both sides of the aisle, but we understood the importance of compromising because it would have been impossible to get something through the New Hampshire legislature and get a budget to my desk if people hadn't been willing to compromise, if they'd been continuing to play the kinds of political games that we're seeing here in Washington. It's unacceptable. Congress can do better. We need to work together. We need to work together to pass this continuing resolution and then to raise the debt ceiling later this year so we avoid the negative effect to families, to businesses, and to our economy. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I would yield 3 minutes of proponent time to Senator Coates, and also, with agreement by the other side, 3 minutes of opponent time.
I thank the Senator. Mr. President.
Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, there has been a great deal of confusion over what's been happening here this week. I know Hoosiers want a clear explanation, and so I would like to take just a moment to explain exactly where I stand on the issue before us. Let me start by laying out a few facts. This is the reality that we face. Fact number 1, every single Republican opposes Obamacare and wants to see it repealed and defunded. That is unassailable. We're all together on that. Second, the House has sent us a bill that would defund Obamacare while keeping the rest of the government running. I supported that bill, and I think we all support that bill. Third, Senate Democrats are united in their opposition to repealing Obamacare, and unfortunately, the fact is, unfortunately from our standpoint, the fact is they control the Senate and they control the White House, and we don't have the votes to prevail. So now the confusion sets in because, well, let's face it, we have a lot of confusing procedures here in the United States Senate, but I have always been guided by the principle that to the extent possible, a yes should be yes and a no should be no on the issue itself. We have all these procedural motions here, and members like to attach that, well, this is what it means if you vote to go forward, or this is what it means if you don't vote to go forward. And it's so easy to run home and say, oh, well, no, on the issue politically, that was procedural, so don't pay any attention to that. Sometimes you have no other option because the majority leader won't allow any votes on the issue itself. In this case, the majority leader has allowed that vote. That is not the case here. So we don't need a procedural vote to determine whether you're for or against Obamacare. We will be able to have a vote if we invoke cloture and move forward and keep this alive for continued debate, not just this week, but next year and however long it takes to deal with this issue. We need to move forward or everything else comes to a standstill. That is why I will be voting to move forward. I will be voting to keep this process alive. Otherwise, everything stops. There is no further action on this. The House of Representatives, controlled by our party, is waiting for us to send this bill back. If we deny cloture, it doesn't go back. They don't have an opportunity to go to the next step. There is bipartisan support for a bill that I have introduced in the Senate, and Todd Young, a congressman from southern Indiana, has not only introduced but passed in the House of Representatives to delay this process for a year so we can continue to address and hopefully repeal Obamacare. The President delayed for business, just again today for small business. He can delay for individuals, and that will give us time to continue this effort. Voting for cloture today so that we can get something back to the House is not a vote against Obamacare or for Obamacare. It's exactly the opposite. It's against Obamacare. It keeps the process alive. Saying otherwise is misleading, and if that was the case, then the procedural vote that we had on Wednesday would not have been 100-0. So those who tried to define this as a procedural vote are essentially stopping the process from going forward and stopping the government from running. It affects military families, it affects veterans, it affects hundreds, if not, well, thousands and thousands of people in critical jobs. It affects people all across my particular state. Sometimes, if you achieve the goal, the problem is this doesn't achieve the goal. We all know that Obamacare has a major proportion of it is funded through mandatory funding, and that is not what we're doing here. We can only affect the appropriations, the discretionary funding, less than 50%. If it achieves the goal, and ultimately we have to do this, but if it achieves the goal, then it probably may be worth considering. But if it doesn't achieve the goal, let's keep this process alive. And let's all of us be on the record with our yes or our no. Let's get this bill back to the House so we can continue the fight, and let's be straight up on where we stand on this issue. Not through a procedural vote, but through a clear yes and no. The American people deserve no less. I commend the passion of my colleagues talking on the floor, trying to get rid of Obamacare. We have a difference of opinion as to how tactically we can address this best. I've come to the judgment and conclusion that I think many are coming to, that instead of just stopping everything, being at a total impasse, shutting down the government, and even if we were successful, it wouldn't address the full shutdown and defunding of Obamacare. I've come to the judgment and best conclusion that we ought to move forward. Our House Republican members are waiting for us to send them legislation, that we can keep this going and come to hopefully a much better resolution than just simply using a procedural gimmick, a procedural process here to define where we stand on this issue. I take a backseat to no one on where I stand on Obamacare, and I will not give up the fight until we achieve the goal. Mr. President, I yield any time I may have left.
Mr. President, I would yield 5 minutes of proponent time to the Senator from Massachusetts, Senator Markey.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you. Mr. President, where is America now? Well, we have an economy in recovery. The Dow was at 7,900 when George W. Bush left office. It's over 15,000 right now. Our deficit is heading downward. Unemployment is still high, but jobs are coming back. But as we make this progress, people continue to struggle, and they expect us to put together a business plan for America out here on the Senate floor and work with the President, work together as Democrats and Republicans to put that plan together for every American family. And what is the Tea Party Republican response? It is to shut down the government, stamp out signs of our fragile economic recovery, send the signal that America can't perform the most basic job of government, and that is to pass a budget. And what is driving these Tea Party Republicans? Well, I know all these Tea Party extremists I serve with in the House of Representatives. I served over there for years. They live by the Republican Tea Party paradox. They hate the government, but paradoxically they have to run for office in order to make sure that the government doesn't work. And that is where they are today. They sent us a bill from the House. They know it won't pass. This is a bill to nowhere. And nowhere is where the Tea Party Republicans want the government to go. The Tea Party Republicans want to repeal Obamacare. I say to those who want to repeal Obamacare, to those who do not like Obamacare, to those who like Obamacare, we have had that debate. We debated it here in Congress. The bill passed. It was signed by the President. It was held up by the Supreme Court of the United States. It is the law. It is time to stop playing games and let the law work. But that's exactly what the Tea Party Republicans are afraid of, that the law will actually work. Shutting down the government for Obamacare is like canceling the World Series because your team didn't make it. Obamacare is the law. You can't cancel the government. You can't cancel the World Series. You have to accept the reality that it is the law. We had an election. But what we have here are the Mad Hatters of the Republican Tea Party here in Congress who have decided that their approach to government, to the old, to the sick, to the needy, to every single principle of the United States of America that we stand for, it's off with their heads for all of those people who depend upon these programs in our country. We are living in an absurd Alice in Wonderland Republican Tea Party world here, Mr. President. This government has to work for the American people. And instead, what they're about to do over this weekend is send another Maalox moment in the marketplace signal to the credit markets of the world that the United States cannot be depended upon to operate a government, to pay its bills, to respond to the needs of the families within our own country, to meet its obligations not only here but around the world. And to those families who are dependent upon a paycheck from the Defense Department, they're wondering. To families who are dependent upon a federal helping hand, they're wondering whether or not they're going to get that help over the next week, over the next 2 weeks, over the next month. And I'll just give you one final example. The National Institutes of Health budget, well, it's really the National Institutes of Hope. That's what we give to families who have somebody with Alzheimer's, with Parkinson's, with cancer, with heart disease. And that budget's being cut and cut and cut and cut. It's being cut at the same time that last year we spent $132 billion worth of taxpayers' money on Alzheimer's patients in our country. So you can't cut the money for the cure and simultaneously say we want to cut the money for taking care of those who have the disease. You can't have it both ways. That's what this nihilistic Tea Party approach is bringing to our people.
The senator's time has expired.
So I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I just hope that the Tea Party Republicans come to their senses.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, we're going to have the opportunity to vote today to reverse course. I think everybody, I think most people agree that Obamacare is not working out as it's intended. In fact, there are members on the other side. We had a Democrat recently say that when it comes to implementation of Obamacare, it's a train wreck. Now, whether you believe it's a train wreck, which is what I happen to believe, or whether it's a slow-motion derailment, it is time for us to reverse course. We have an opportunity to go in a different direction with the vote that we're going to have here in about an hour on whether or not to defund Obamacare. And I think that the overwhelming opinion across this country, an overwhelming number of Americans believe that this is not working. It's hurting middle-class families. It is costing us jobs. It is driving up health insurance premiums for people across this country. And we need to do something to reverse course. So if you look at how this impacts or average people in my state of South Dakota, and I'll use that as an example, you've got young people today who, when they look at what they're paying in terms of health insurance premiums this year and what they're going to pay under the exchanges when the exchanges kick in, and this is some analysis that was done by the Manhattan Institute, said a healthy 30-year-old in South Dakota is going to be looking at, if you're a woman, a 223% premium increase as a result of Obamacare. If you're a young man, and I use a 30-year-old again in South Dakota as an example of this, you're going to be facing a 393% premium increase. When you compare the data that is being put out by the Department of Health and Human Services with what people in my state of South Dakota are paying today for similar coverage. And I'm using the bronze plan under the exchanges as a case in point. So for a young person in South Dakota, you're talking about $1,500 more a year to pay for health insurance if you are a woman, and $2,000 a year more if you're a man. This money is money that could be used to pay off student loans, save for a home, maybe start a family. And it's not just young adults that are going to be faced with making tough budget decisions between having health care and paying for other items. We know also that families are seeing health care premiums skyrocket since the president took office by about $3,000, by about $2,500 since Obamacare became law. And that's happening at a time, Mr. President, when average household income is going down. If you look at the average household income since the president took office, it's down by about $3,600. So families are seeing health insurance premiums go up by $3,000, average household income going down by $3,600. As you can see, middle-class families in this country are being squeezed from both ends. But we have an opportunity to correct that. And today, Mr. President, is a vote. It's going to be on defunding Obamacare. I've been a big advocate for delaying, defunding, replacing, repealing. When it comes to this issue, count me as one of the all of the above. Anything we can do to get rid of this bad law and the harmful impacts that it's having on the American people. The vote today is going to be on defunding. And I would dare say that every Republican in this chamber, all 46 Republicans, will be casting a vote to defund Obamacare. There isn't a single Republican in the chamber today or when this vote was cast, when this law was passed back in 2009, that voted for it. And since that time, we've had numerous votes, I think 29 or 30 votes here in the United States Senate on repealing all or parts of Obamacare. So everybody here is going to be on the record today in favor of defunding this bad law. All it will take is 5 Democrats. 5 Democrats to get us to the 51 votes necessary to change the direction, change the course, turn this train around and head it in a different direction. Mr. President, Republicans are going to be united on that point. There's sometimes a difference of opinion on tactics about the best way to reach the goal, but one thing that unites all Republicans is the goal, and that is doing away with this bad law and its impact, harmful impact on the American people, on middle-class families, on jobs, and on our economy. The question before the House is, are there going to be Democrats, a handful of Democrats, 5 is all it takes, to stand with Republicans today and help us defund this law. Nearly 60% of Americans say they oppose Obamacare. We can stop it. We can stop it. We can start over, get a do-over, if you will, and do this the right way. And we've talked about many times, Mr. President, the things that we would do differently if we had the opportunity to write a law that actually would address the health care challenges that people face in this country, that would create greater competition in the marketplace by allowing people to buy insurance across state lines, by allowing groups, small businesses, to join larger groups and pools so they get the benefit of group purchasing power, by reducing the cost of defensive medicine, by ending a lot of the junk lawsuits that clog up the system today, by allowing people to have a refundable tax credit where they can buy their own health insurance and they have more choice, more competition. These are all approaches, Mr. President, that we think make sense and would provide a positive alternative to the American people that wouldn't cost us the jobs, that wouldn't be driving up health insurance premiums by 393% for a 30-year-old man in the state of South Dakota or 223% for a 30-year-old woman, and that would give American families an opportunity to save more for their future, to provide for their families, and hopefully to invest in what is a better and a more prosperous future for their children and grandchildren. So that's the vote before us today, Mr. President. Again, I don't think belabor the point when it comes to the harmful impacts this has had. If you look at what it's doing to jobs, if you look at what it's doing to employers, we talk to people all the time. I don't doubt there's a member here in the United States Senate who, when they go home to their states on weekends, doesn't have conversations with small businesses, with employers who are talking about what this is doing to their ability to create jobs, to put people to work, to raise salaries, to make sure that the people that they employ have a better future for their families. But clearly, as long as this bad law stays in place, it is going to be more expensive and more difficult for businesses in this country to create jobs. It is going to be more difficult, more expensive for middle-class families to make ends meet. and it is going to create a much bigger, more expansive government that is going to cost the American taxpayer way more than I think was originally promised, and certainly is going to add significantly the massive amount of debt that we're passing on to future generations. We have an opportunity to get a do-over today. There's been the talk during the implementation of this that it's got glitches and bumps and inaccuracies and malfunctions. Well, this isn't ready for prime time. I think we can all acknowledge that. At a minimum, we ought to figure out a way to delay this and change course, change direction, and go in a better direction for America's future. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Just the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call